All right, welcome and good morning. Welcome to our CGMC halftime legislative session report. Um, I would say it's not even quite halftime, it's more like entering the third period of the hockey game or the seventh inning stretch of a baseball game. Halftime might be a little bit deceptive. Nonetheless, we've got 6 weeks left here in the legislative session before they have to adjourn in the third week of May, the constitutional deadline. And so the legislature is just coming back from their Easter Passover break. And so we thought it would be a good time to do an update with our CGMC members and also our Greater Minnesota Partnership members who have also been invited to participate. We're happy to have you here as well. So again, my name is Bradley Peterson. As we go along here, we'll take questions at the end. You can use the Q&A function to type up your question as we're going along, and then my colleague Alex will read them out loud to the group because I am incapable of multitasking, and so that will just make it go better. But if you have questions, punch them into the Q&A function. So diving right in, we've got lots to talk about. Here. The legislature has been tremendously busy, but they still have a lot left to do. And so for the next 45 minutes to an hour or so, we'll talk a little bit about the legislative landscape, just kind of the basics, where things stand. We'll touch on the DFL trifecta budget and what they are proposing in terms of big picture, in terms of their priorities. And then we'll dig in and talk about what it means for CGMC priorities, specifically local government aid, environmental regulatory issues, the bonding bill, economic development, transportation, and then we will finish by touching on some issues related to paid family leave and duty disability more in the labor and employment perspective. And then we'll talk about kind of what our overall message here is for the next 6 weeks going forward. So we're happy to have you we've got a great turnout today. And so let's get right into it with the legislative landscape. And so I would say that session has had sort of the most normal feel since the pandemic, but we were talking internally here yesterday that maybe normal should really be in quotes, because as it certainly has been normal in terms of access to the Capitol, what committee hearings and testimony has felt like, being able to run into legislators in the hallway, all of that has very much kind of the pre-pandemic feel that gives longtime Capitol people all of the warm, touchy-feelies. But it would have to be, I think, in quotations because the legislature has been moving at a tremendous pace. The scope and breadth of what the DFL trifecta is looking to accomplish is beyond anything I think any of us who have been around the Capitol for a long time have ever seen. Early in session, they moved a lot of progressive items, 100% clean energy by 2040, codifying reproductive rights, free school meals, breakfast and lunch for all of the school kids, driver's license for all, and a host of other things that would, I think, be appropriately labeled on the progressive end of the spectrum. And this has really left GOP minorities in the House and Senate with very little influence. I'm sure if you have a Republican legislator, you've heard a lot of grumbling about how the DFL is not listening, how they're just moving along very quickly with their agenda. You can hardly sort of get your brain around all the things that they're doing. Part of that, I think, is just true. They have been moving very quickly and at an unprecedented speed. And part of that is just sort of the natural gripes that come with being in the minority, where you feel like you are not really part of the action, which is how the legislative process works in some cases. So things have been moving very, very quickly in a very progressive bent. And like I said, the DFL trifecta really does have a clear sense of what it is that they're trying to do. I think one of the things you'll hear from Speaker Hortman when she talks about the pace at which they are moving, she said that public expects us to come in here and get our job done, and there's no reason to delay or dilly-dally. Governor Walz is fond of saying that the era of gridlock is over. And so you'll see that as a theme here throughout our presentation, the ways in which they've been working together to move the session along in a pretty efficient manner. So let's talk a little bit about the DFL budget. And this is one of those cases where they really have worked together to at least frame up the basics of their budget. Starting though, what kind of situation are we in? As everyone knows, we have a significant surplus, over $17 billion, according to the most recent February forecast. One thing to note about this surplus, though, is that a certain portion of it, that portion that's in blue in the chart here, is really what you can count on as ongoing money year after year after year. And that's really about $5.3 billion. The other $12 billion is what we would call sort of one-time money. This is generally carryovers of surpluses from biennium past. And so it carries over from one year to the next if they don't spend it. And so you've got the structural surplus, the 5.3 billion, and then the one-time money, which you can spend on all sorts of things, but you don't want to necessarily program into your budget, is the $12 billion. And that'll become important for some of our discussions here going forward. You can see the next bar over on that chart, 2026-27 is what was projected. Now this would include all of the one-time money that is in the current biennium or the next biennium, and assumes that it's not spent. So that number will likely go down here as the legislature gets in and does their business. But you can see significant surpluses here over the next 4 years in terms of the planning horizon that the legislature looks at. So that lays the foundation for the budget proposals that are going to be going through the legislature here. And one of the things that is, I think, really unprecedented, it's certainly not something that I have seen here in my time at the legislature, is budget targets being set this early in session. Usually the way this plays out is if you've got one body in the hands of the Republicans and one body in the hands of the Senate, they set kind of their separate spending priorities. They run bills through committees, come up with wildly different ideas about what you'll spend in education or health and human services or in the tax bill, and then have to reconcile that with the governor once they get into conference committee, which usually isn't until May. So what is different about this is that the Governor Walz, the DFL House, the DFL Senate have all agreed ahead of time as they're doing their budget bills through committees in their respective bodies on what the big picture targets will be. And so this is a snapshot here of some of the main highlights of the budget targets. And the way to think about these budget target numbers is this is what they're going to spend over and above what is currently programmed into law. And so another way to think about it is this is how they're going to spend the $17 billion surplus. So you can see there, education is going to get a big boost to $2.2 billion. Health and human services, a significant amount of money. They set aside some money for capital projects, $2.2 billion, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. $1 billion plus for transportation, $1 billion for housing and homelessness. And then in the tax area, about $3 billion in new spending or tax cuts. All of that, including the other things that aren't accounted for on this chart, total up to about $17.5 billion. And so a lot of money, but think of this as how are they going to spend the surplus over and above what the budget would have otherwise been. So let's talk about LGA, our top priority from the CGMC perspective. Lots going on, and certainly if you want a deeper dive and blow by blow on LGA, we did a webinar a couple of weeks ago that got into all issues LGA, and that is available on our website in the archived portions of things on the CGMC website. So if you haven't checked that out, but do have LGA questions or are just curious, I would encourage you to take a look at that. So what were our asks going into session here? Well, we had an ask of $150 million increase to the local government aid appropriation. This was actually a joint ask at the legislature, some legislators urging with the counties, LGA and CPA. So each are looking for $150 million increase to both of those programs. On the city side, we also had the LGA formula updates that we've been working on with the League of Cities, Metro Cities, Small Cities, and that have been largely agreed to by those organizations to refresh the formula after 10 years. The last time we did that work was in 2013, and we tend to do it every 10 years or so after the decennial census. And so there is a formula, a new formula out that's being discussed. It is moving forward. And again, if you have more questions about that, you can certainly be in touch with me or check out the excellent webinar that we did a couple of weeks ago. And then finally, part of the ask is for the appropriation to tie that to inflation and population growth. So for next year, we'd get a $150 million increase, and then that would continue to grow over time with inflation and population growth, which is something that was actually programmed into the LGA appropriation back in the late 90s. And it helped cities plan, helped restrain property taxes. And so that is also part of our ask to do that adjustment. So one of the things that I think we've always been cognizant of, and we've talked a lot about even before session started, was the just things that we would be competing with in terms of our LGA ask. And so now that we know a tax bill target, which is a $3 billion increase in spending or tax cuts, we kind of know a little bit more about what the landscape is. And to be quite honest, in my assessment, the target seems pretty tight to do all of the things that have been discussed. And so other things that would be competing with LGA, they want to make some pretty significant changes to the renter's credit, which would be fairly costly, child and dependent care credit, the WALS checks, the one-time payouts to folks to return part of the surplus would come out of this budget bucket. The public safety aid that Governor Walz has proposed, the one-time aid for public safety issues. And then if they are going to do something on the Social Security tax exemption, it would also come out of this. The Social Security thing is more of a priority for folks in the Senate than it is in the House. And so it'll be interesting to see as they get into conference committee how they reconcile those issues. But there's a lot of spending / tax cut ideas that need to be fit into that $3 billion target. So we've got our work cut out for us in terms of making the case that LGA needs to be one of the priorities. So kicking off the whole LGA discussion, Governor Walz proposed his budget in mid to late January. And at that time, it included a $30 million increase in local government aid. We responded, as you might recall, with a lot of surprise and disappointment, given the overall size of the budget surplus. $30 million was not, from our perspective, adequate. He has since, in the supplemental budget, bumped that up to $40 million. So I think a gesture of goodwill moving in our direction. But obviously, I think we're still going to be working with the legislature to make sure that that number is a lot higher. And then finally, he did embrace the proposed updates to the LGA formula that we had proposed. So that was part of his proposal as well, and certainly very positive. In terms of the legislature, we had our legislation going through the House and Senate. You can see snapshots here from the hearing that we had in the House Property Tax Division. There is Mayor Larry Cuffey from Virginia testifying next to bill author Dave Lislegard, who has been our main champion in the House when it comes to local government aid. And then on the right side, you've got Mayor Rick Schultz from St. Joseph, Minnesota, testifying on our bill in the Senate. And so we've had good hearings in both the House and the Senate, very engaged members in terms of the discussion. I think in both cases, we had a really good outing to put our case forward. So going forward here, where we stand now in terms of each of the House and the Senate and the governor with where folks are at, you've got the governor with his $40 million increase. You've got the House with their $100 million increase, plus the inflation factor. And so that's where you see in that orange bar, the difference between the governor and the House for 2025. The governor does not factor inflation into the appropriation, so it would just stay flat. Whereas in the House, they are factoring in inflation, and that would be an estimated additional $28 million. The Senate has not yet come out with any kind of LGA number that they are thinking about. So they are a giant question mark. My hope is, though, that we'll be able to see that here in the next week or two, which gets us to the next steps on the tax bill and the LGA bill. So they do still need to, in the House, unveil their full tax bill. The $100 million that's moving through the House right now was part of the property tax sort of subcommittee, their recommendation onto the full tax committee. So they still have to unveil their tax bill in committee, as does the Senate. And at that point, then we'll kind of see where everybody stands. They will be different. I think, one of the interesting things about the beginning of session was that on many of these proposals, the House and Senate were sort of marching in lockstep and trying to keep their proposals as close to each other as possible. But I think as we start to see these budget bills, we are going to see differences between the House and Senate, and I have no doubt, absolutely, that there will be significant differences between the House and Senate tax bills. So they'll have to continue their way through the process and then be passed off the House and Senate floor and then be reconciled in conference committee. And I would imagine that by the last week in April, the very beginning of May, they will begin meeting in the tax conference committee to reconcile their proposals together. And so that will be the next couple of steps here as we go forward. All right, now I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Elizabeth, who's going to talk about some of the environmental issues that we've been dealing with this legislative session. So Liz, on to you.
Thank you, Bradley. And it's great to be speaking with all of you. I wish I could see you all in person. But as Bradley said, my name is Elizabeth Wafel, and I do the environmental and energy lobbying for the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities. Heading into this session, I'll be honest, I thought that dealing with environmental issues was going to be pretty simple. We had a few just easy goals. We were going to put some money into lead pipes to help y'all map and replace your lead pipes, and then try and put a whole bunch of money into the PFA for wastewater and drinking water. But I guess I shouldn't have been surprised when a whole slew of issues and challenges are popping up in Greater Minnesota that we've had to deal with at both the legislature and at agency levels. Those issues range from everything to PFAS, changing weather patterns, groundwater contamination, surface water concerns, aging infrastructure, lead pipes, and concerns about environmental justice. Now, I don't have time to tackle all of those today, but I'm going to hit on a few that were really sort of time-consuming and important. First is environmental justice. If you're not familiar with the concept, basically, this is trying to get at a historical problem that exists in Minnesota. It exists across the country, in which minorities and low-income people have lived in heavily polluted areas. And this challenge has arisen because of things like racially restrictive covenants, where minorities and others have had limited choices of where they could live in metropolitan areas. And then zoning has typically placed heavy industry, highways, and other pollution sources in those same areas. And as a result of all of those different factors, we've seen significant health issues develop, ranging from asthma to heart disease and other things related to that pollution. And we especially see it in certain pockets of, say, Minneapolis and other neighborhoods in urban areas, but not just in the metro area. We've seen some of this throughout the state. It is an emerging area of law at both the federal and state level. And as a result, sort of how you deal with it and the remedies are really uncertain. And so that's something we've spent a lot of time on. Now, addressing environmental justice, everybody can point to it's a problem, but how you address it is challenging. And I'll be talking about some of the remedies that have been proposed, but a variety of remedies have been proposed. Unfortunately, there's, despite the strong desire for action, we haven't yet seen some of the analysis and data to look at whether or not the proposals that are moving at the legislature would achieve the goal of protecting disadvantaged communities. And that's really important. And that's, why we've been involved, because we think, absolutely, we do need to focus on this problem, but at the same time, we need to make sure it's not undermining our environmental goals and that it actually works and that it's also promoting economic growth. So this is something, again, I'm going to talk about some of the different areas where it popped up. First up, cumulative impacts. This is, sort of really getting at the concept of environmental justice. It's a proposal that would sort of attempt to put guardrails around projects that would emit pollution in areas that have really been heavily affected by pollution and other issues in the past. And would kind of require an analysis of the total impacts anytime certain permits or other changes are being made, and would also require engagement of community members. The challenge we've seen, however, as we've been getting more engaged, is that to date, some of the proposals have been way too broad. The proposals have, applied or required this cumulative impacts analysis in areas that are considered environmental justice areas. but at least the initial bills have been defining that so broadly, it would cover almost every population center in the state. We've also seen, proposals that would cover wastewater and most air permits. And, why it's concerning is that if you are subject to this proposal, it would mean that if you were, in some circumstances renewing, getting a new permit, or you're expanding, you'd be required to take on the work and the expense of undertaking complex analysis about how your facility, will impact a lot of different factors, sort of above and beyond your normal permit analysis. Permit analysis, permits could be denied for a much broader reason, and it would also allow outside groups to participate in the negotiations. So we have been, over the last several weeks, working with other stakeholders to try and narrow these issues and really get it focused in on, okay, what problems are we trying to solve? Is the proposal solving those problems? And how can we address these important problems without sort of completely redoing, how we do environmental permitting in the state? So an important issue, we're going to continue to work on it. MPCA Citizens Board. If you've been around a while, you might remember that there used to be, for a long time, a 8-member citizens board that basically governed a lot of the work of the MPCA. It had some power over permits, more power over environmental review and rulemaking, but it wasn't always popular. And so after a number of decisions that people were unhappy with, it was eliminated on a bipartisan basis back in 2015 at the legislature. However, this year, again, we had a change in control, and there is a new proposal. The legislation popped up in both the House and the Senate, but only made it into the House Omnibus bill, but it would reinstate the board. And the difference here is it's not just like going back to the way it was. It would actually be giving them significantly more power, including the power to say yay or nay on all permits and variance decisions. Another important distinction is that the membership, in terms of who could serve on it, would be a lot more limited. It would have to include 3 members of underrepresented communities, 1 labor union member, and 1 small farmer. It would not require any sort of technical expertise with respect to the subject matter. And in fact, in sort of a bizarre twist, wastewater operators would be specifically excluded from serving on the board, at least if they're actively employed in that business. So, there's probably a time and space to really work with getting citizen input on MPCA decisions. There are a lot of opportunities right now. Maybe they could be fine-tuned, but this proposal right now is really problematic. And so we have been, again, working with authors and whatnot to try and, get either, to achieve these goals, but not in this manner. So, and then PFA, again, this is where I thought I'd be spending most of my time this year. Public Facilities Authority, I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with it, but the PFA makes it possible for our cities to construct and upgrade their wastewater and drinking water facilities. Most projects are eligible for loans, and certain grants and forgivable loans are also awarded based on affordability criteria. Over the last year or so, however, the House Bonding Chair has expressed concerns that the metrics used to determine affordability and therefore eligibility for these grants is not up to date and does not reflect concerns about environmental justice. And so he has unveiled legislation that would completely upend the way that sort of these grants and loans are done. And the challenge with it is when you do the deep dive into his proposal, it would, at least the way it's drafted, it would shift a lot of funds to larger cities who may not need money, and because of the interaction with federal law, could actually cause significant problems for these local loan programs, making it really hard for everybody to go forward and do their projects. Now, this is something we are very concerned about. And so, we actually, myself and Bradley, met with the author last week. And the meeting went better than we thought, and, trying to understand his concerns. And his main focus is he wants to get the funding to go to areas of real need. So we are working with him, with the PFA and others, to see if we can sort of thread that needle and keep these very important programs intact, while also ensuring that funding is getting where it's needed. Lead pipes, again, an issue that we've really been talking about a lot over the last 2 years. And if you haven't started talking about it at your city level, you probably will be soon. The EPA, the federal EPA, is requiring all cities to conduct an inventory by October 2024. And for many of you, if you have lead pipes, that might end up being having some removal requirements after that. The challenge is that it's expensive to remove those pipes, especially for homeowners. And in many cities, the lead is actually on the homeowner side, not the city side. So we have been working with 2 labor unions, as well as the city of St. Paul and Conservation Minnesota on a proposal that would have funded $800 million over 10 years to get these lead pipes out on both the city side and on the homeowner side. Now, we really wanted that total, but as I think Bradley mentioned, there wasn't a lot of money available in the out years, but we were able to get a down payment of $240 million for the next biennium that, there's going to be available statewide to both help with the inventories and start working on getting those pipes out. And the money will be available over a number of years. It's just going to be sort of put into a pot over the next 2 years. Right now, the bill is waiting on the floor in the Senate, and it will be going to House Ways and Means. There's some minor differences between the bills that we think can get worked out in conference committee, but there's a lot of support for this bill. We've been working hard on it and really want to see it get past the finish line. And then finally, what's an environmental discussion without a little mention of PFAS, right? For those of you who have not heard me talk about this over the last 5 years, PFAS are a class of chemicals, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And challenge with PFAS is that they can cause serious health issues when they're in your drinking water. It's also challenging because it's very expensive to remove from drinking water and nearly impossible to get out of wastewater. And that's why we've been engaged on this issue for a number of years, really focusing on how do we control the source of PFAS and how do we get funding to take action. Now, the legislature also has been stepping up on this, and we saw multiple proposals flying around the Senate and House. Some of them we support, some of them worry us a little bit more. We have been supportive of some of the proposals to ban certain uses of PFAS. Again, that's source control. We've also been very supportive of funding that would help remove at the drinking water level and monitor at various stages. Again, sort of source control and addressing the drinking water problem. We have been a little bit more concerned about a proposal coming out of the House that would require water quality rulemaking on several, I think 6 different types of PFAS by 2026. And the reason we are concerned is, as I mentioned, right now, it's not technologically feasible, to get this out at our wastewater facilities. And the challenge is once you put it in a rule, then the MPCA has to start putting in your permit. And even if we can try and get variances for it, that's not always easy. And so we think it's really important sort of that, we take guidance from what the feds are doing and trying to keep this sort of the rulemaking march along with the science. We know that rules are going to happen out there and we are going to end up with limits, but we also have to, do it when the time is right. So, but PFAS is an issue, again, we will be continuing to work on over the next several years.
All right, thanks, Liz. As you can tell, Liz has been very, very busy on the environmental policy front, dealing with a lot of very tricky and nettlesome issues, things that come through legislation that is well-meaning, but has a lot of detail to them and a lot of things that need to be vetted and worked out to make sure that they actually work throughout the state and don't have other unintended consequences. So it's a lot going on there, but we wanted to give you a sense for just the scope of the activity and all the different things that we've been facing on that front. Somewhat related, as since we're talking about water and water infrastructure, is the bonding bill. So how is it going on the bonding bill? Well, it is going poorly. As you can see by my unhappy face here at a press conference that I was doing with the House and Senate bonding chairs, as well as some construction trades laborers. So as you know, bonding bill requires that the House pass it first and that it be passed with a supermajority in both bodies. And as you also recall, last year was supposed to be the year for a big bonding bill. Even yet numbered years are the years for traditional large investments in capital items. And really, they just fell flat last year, never really unveiled any kind of bill. There were lots of negotiations, lots of items that may or may not have been in bills, but nothing ever materialized at the very end. And so really, the bonding discussion this year is finishing last year's unfinished work, which makes this especially frustrating. So in the House, they unveiled the bonding bill that it was largely based on many of the negotiations that were had last year. And that bill passed with 21 Republican members voting in favor, which is pretty significant. As we said, you need both Republican and Democrat votes to pass a bonding bill because of the supermajority requirement, and they got 21. And that bill made historic commitments to water and water infrastructure. It also had funding for childcare, the BDPI grant program, a lot of transportation items, and a lot of individual CGMC member projects were also funded. And so it was a very good bill from our perspective. We were pleased to see it pass on a bipartisan basis in the House. However, once we got to the Senate, which this press conference was urging the Senate to join their House colleagues and vote for a bill, it failed on a party line vote with all Democrats voting in favor and all Republicans voting against. And so what was really the Republican stance on this? What are they looking for? Well, they're looking for leverage. As we talked at the outset, I think the House and Senate Republican minorities are frustrated because they feel like they don't have a way to insert themselves into the discussion. And bonding, because you do need a supermajority, is really one of the places where they might have some leverage from their perspective. And so right before the vote in the Senate, they had a press conference indicating that there would be no votes for a bonding bill until there was meaningful tax relief. And during that debate, they tried to tie it to the Social Security tax exemption and getting that passed. That did not go through at that time. And so they took a straight up or down vote on the bonding bill, and it failed. Now, following the failure of the bonding bill, the Senate GOP seemed to double down on this strategy and not only pressed for tax cuts, but also agreement on some funding items such as long-term care. And so here's why I think that this is a problem, and why, though I understand the impulse, and I understand from their perspective what they're trying to do, that in order to actually pass a bonding bill, this is a poor strategy. If you want to make these capital investments, if you want to invest in water and wastewater and roads and bridges and all of these other projects, I think that this strategy puts that in danger, because with the size of the surplus and all of the one-time money that's available, the DFL doesn't necessarily need GOP votes to move an infrastructure package. They could do it all through cash. And so at this juncture, there's a couple of ways that this could go. And we've heard rumblings and mumblings of all of this. There's been some discussion that the Senate GOP might be given a second chance to vote for the bonding bill. They bring it off the table and have another vote on it, hoping that they could get 7 or 8 Republican senators to vote with the Democrats to pass the bill. That's been one option that has been discussed a little bit. The other option that's been getting most of the discussion, however, is to do an all-cash bill that would essentially sidestep the need for GOP votes. Because it's all cash, it would be just like any other spending item. You only need a supermajority if you are doing bonding, if you are issuing state debt. And so if you do a cash bill, you don't need Republican votes. That would mean, however, probably, likely, fewer projects in Republican districts and also fewer projects in greater Minnesota overall. Because again, if the DFLers are asking DFLers to vote for an infrastructure package, they're going to put DFL projects in it. And so it's unclear at that point how CGMC priorities related to water and wastewater and the like would fare under this option. I think it is optimal from our perspective that they do a traditional bonding bill, involve Republicans and Democrats, but that does also mean that Republicans are going to have to commit to voting for a bill. That would be the optimal outcome. Cash would be a less optimal outcome, but still better than nothing, because we'd still be making investments in infrastructure, hopefully on a statewide basis. So that's where we're at in terms of the bonding bill. It is very much to be determined in terms of what will be happening next. In the targets that the governor and House and Senate committed to, they did set aside about $2.2 billion for capital investment. So they could just spend all cash and do a pretty big package that way. But again, that would probably result in fewer Republican projects, fewer projects in greater Minnesota. All right, we want to touch briefly on a couple of economic development items, specifically housing, childcare, and BDPI. We've been working on these with our partners at the Greater Minnesota Partnership, our kind of economic development sister organization that's made up of chambers of commerce, the initiative funds, various businesses in Greater Minnesota, EDAs in Greater Minnesota, other nonprofits doing good work around these issues. And so we've been working with them on these issues. In housing, as I mentioned, they have $1 billion target for housing. That's a lot of money going towards housing. And in terms of the things that we've been working on specifically, we've been working on the Greater Minnesota Workforce Housing Grant, which there's pretty strong alignment between the governor, Senate, and House on $40 million of one-time money to get some money out there, and then $4 million on an ongoing basis. Again, historic funding levels for that program. And then a new program that we've been working to get off the ground is the Greater Minnesota Housing Infrastructure Program. Think of this as BDPI for housing. It would help pay for the public infrastructure parts of housing development. And again, pretty good alignment between the Senate and House perspectives in terms of some money in the housing bill and some money in the bonding bill. These are the things that we've been specifically working on from a Greater Minnesota perspective, but with that extra $950 million worth of investment that's being made in the next biennium, certainly they will fund programs that will also go to benefit our cities through all of the different things that MHFA does. Likewise, in childcare, we've really been focusing on, what can we do from a Greater Minnesota perspective to help stand up and support childcare providers in our communities to make sure that there is access to childcare. And again, pretty good alignment on the DEED program that has been very successful in spreading money around the state and kind of providing the top off for a lot of projects childcare related. The governor, Senate, and House have all come in at $13 million for that program. And then on the Initiative Foundation side, again, a couple of years ago, this program was created to send money out to the Initiative Foundations for them to support childcare providers and do some of the capacity building, the studying, the what needs to happen to get childcare in our area kind of work, to $7 million, again, from each of the governor, Senate, and House. And so that's very positive. Again, there's lots of money that's being spent in the childcare area with the CCAP program, that is the sliding scale, buy down the cost for families, as well as the scholarships. So lots of money going into the childcare area. All of it will benefit Greater Minnesota in some way. These two programs here are the Greater Minnesota specific programs to help build out our capacity and access in our communities. And then finally, BDPI, the Business Development Public Infrastructure Grant Program. There's money in both the jobs bill and the bonding bill, should it pass, for these programs here. Again, Senate and House pretty well aligned, and then the governor as well on the job side. So there is money in play for that program. That bucket is empty. Of course, as you know, that program has been very effective in helping to build the public infrastructure that supports job expansion and development in our community. So lots of opportunity here in the jobs bill for our initiatives. Now, finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about paid family leave and duty disability. And these are issues that we don't typically, from the CGMC perspective, get involved in, but we've been directed by our board to do more on them. And I think I would put these two items in the category, similar category to a lot of the environmental items that Liz talked about earlier. These are all very well-intentioned proposals, but with a lot of moving parts that have a lot of significant impact on cities as employers, as well as other employers in Greater Minnesota. And there's a lot of detail to be worked out. And so what we're going to give you is a very, on paid family leave, a very high level look at where things stand currently. Certainly, if you have more questions, we can get into it deeper offline, because there are, like I said, a lot of moving pieces. It's a very complicated piece of legislation. There are currently 11 states that are in some phase of implementing a paid family leave program. Minnesota's would be amongst the most generous should it pass. And so what are the basics here? Well, first off, it is a very, very high priority for the DFL trifecta. That is why it is Senate File 2 and House File 2. They want to make this happen. I think the governor, the Senate, and the House have all been very clear that something will pass in some form. And so it creates, obviously, a paid family medical leave program that's paid for by employer and employee premiums. And in terms of its actual functioning, it's almost analogous to how unemployment insurance system run through deed would work. The benefits would be tracked and administered through deed. Essentially, at deed, you're going to be standing up a whole new organization, a whole new insurance company, basically, with 300 to 400 new employees to administer this program. The startup costs are estimated at $668 million. That's before employers start paying premiums. And so very complicated piece of legislation. It has had lots of committee stops so far as it's gone through. And so very high level again on the House side, which I would say is going to be the more expansive of the two proposals so far. Weeks allowed up to 12 weeks for medical, 12 weeks of family and caregiving leave. Between those two on the Senate, they've narrowed it down to 20 weeks between the two. 0.07% payroll tax in both proposals, although in the Senate, they do give a reduction for employers with less than 30 employees. You still have to participate in the program, but your premiums will be less. Definition of family has been one of the things that some of the folks who have expressed concern have brought up. Both are pretty broad. In the House, though, it's even more broad in that it has this language that basically includes someone with sort of an affinity relation to the employee. So it's not as easily defined as, you know, a parent, grandparent, adopted child, you know, all of the things which you can draw a pretty straight line towards. But it's more expansive in that it includes people for whom the employee has an affinity that is family-like. So pretty broad from that perspective. Treatment of seasonal employees is one of the other changes between the two. In the House, seasonal employees would be included in the program. And in the Senate, they just recently amended their proposal that would exclude seasonal employees who work 150 days a year or less. And so I think a nod towards certainly the tourism industry, hospitality, and also those cities and counties that have seasonal employees that are working in the parks or the golf course or whatnot. And then finally, there's you know, one of the big questions here that's still being worked out is how will existing benefits that folks have accrued be treated. In the House, you're not eligible to use paid family medical leave if you're using other leave in the same week as you're using some sort of PFML leave through the state. In the Senate, it's a little bit more permissive. You may use existing leave banks if you are concurrently PFML eligible. Again, something that is very much being worked out, certainly in the public sector. We've got a lot of employees who have over time banked a lot of leave time and would not necessarily be required to use that time first or even in conjunction with any of the circumstances of paid family medical leave. So lots of details there to be worked out. That's just a very high level look between the House and the Senate. Both versions have gone through multiple committees, as I've said, and has been heavily amended. A lot have been fairly technical tweaks. I would say the Senate version, many of the amendments there have been more with an eye towards making it workable for employers. Businesses and local governments have been trying to make the proposal workable. I think everybody acknowledges, from the Chamber of Commerce to our organization, that something is going to happen. And so really we just have to make sure that where there are issues or concerns, that those are ironed out or addressed in some way in the context of the legislation. So CGMC has been participating in these discussions, but we've been mostly letting the League of Cities and the Association of Minnesota Counties take the lead on behalf of local governments, but we have been at the table and working with others in the local government space and the business space on these issues. And I think that before it crosses the finish line, it will likely require more amendments. I think there are a number of legislators, especially in the Senate, that are really looking closely at how this is going to work. I think it's a lot more real to people since it does have a good chance of passing, and they want to get it right. They want to make sure that they've got a program that provides the benefits to those who need it, and also is not unduly burdensome to employers at the same time. So it's still to be worked out. But again, I think something will pass here this session with some changes and tweaks. And so stay tuned on that. And then finally, on the labor and employment side, and the last topical issue we'll talk about here is duty disability. And this really rises out of the instance of the significant claims that we've seen from public safety employees related to PTSD and mental health issues. So these are your policemen, your firefighters, your state patrol officers. And what has been happening is a lot of these claims have been going through. They are almost all are universally approved by PERA, the Public Employment Retirement Association. And at that point, they get a duty disability pension. But the impact for cities and counties, of course, as you know, is that they continue to be able to be on and paid for their health insurance through age 65. And so that has been an increasing cost for local governments here going forward. And so the legislature a couple of years ago sort of started going down this path of how can we deal with this, specifically related to PTSD. Again, the League and the Association of Minnesota Counties have been leading the discussions on behalf of local governments in this. And what they have worked out with the employee groups, police, fire, those folks, is actually the creation of a new benefit that before a public safety employee can receive a duty disability designation for a mental health condition, they must receive up to 24 weeks of treatment. The goal being to return that employee back to work if possible, and thereby reduce the number of personnel leaving permanently, relieve pressures on staffing, reduce the cost for local governments in terms of paying for the ongoing health insurance obligation, and to get the employee back to a healthy state where they're contributing to, they're in the workforce and they're contributing and they're engaged in their communities. So that is the goal of the legislation. The local government employer would pay for the treatment, but it is in the bill currently fully reimbursed by the state. And this is a key for us. We're not necessarily wild about this approach of this bill. We think that there should be more process changes, not only as it relates to PTSD, but the whole duty disability system and other injuries as well. And so it is very, very important that if we are going to create this new benefit, that it is fully reimbursed by the state, which under this legislation it would be. Likewise, there has been for years a public safety officer benefit account, which has been intended to reimburse cities and counties for the cost of the ongoing health insurance obligation. However, this fund has been underfunded, woefully underfunded. And so the legislation would also fully fund all of the reimbursements required for the ongoing health insurance obligation. Like I said, the bill does not make the process changes that we would have liked to have seen. We did introduce legislation this year. We did engage with legislators. We met with PRA on these items. And I think they were sort of too far down the road in terms of the approach being taken with the treatment and the focus specifically on PTSD to take a step back and look at any of the bigger process concerns that we have in terms of employer transparency in the process, ability to weigh in, ability to present our own evidence, that kind of thing. So we will see where this goes. There has been some pushback to parts of this bill from folks in the public safety community. It is going to be a costly proposal that the legislature will have to take on. But again, absolutely, if they are not going to fully reimburse these items, we would have to come out swinging against this pretty hard, I think, because cities just cannot take on the extra obligations without some sort of process reform to limit the number of claims being made and making sure that those claims are well vetted. So that's duty disability. Again, on both of these items, the paid family leave and duty disability, if you've got more questions about really the moving parts, definitely be in touch with us and we can discuss those offline. Transportation, I lied. There's actually one more issue area that we're going to talk about very briefly here. Small city streets. There's been a fund. The problem with that has been we have not had ongoing funding. And so we've been gunning for at least $25 million a year Likewise, we've been looking for additional funding for larger city streets. And then finally, corridors of commerce has been at discussion as well. So we'll talk about each one of those in turn. So we talked about all of the money that's available through the state, the $17.5 billion surplus that we have, most of it being one-time money. And so I think folks have been surprised when they've seen these transportation proposals come out, and they have included proposals for new revenues, tax and fee increases to fund ongoing obligations for our transportation system. That's largely because the current revenue sources for transportation have been lagging. They did take a hit during the pandemic, and we've not quite caught up. And so our transportation system, to the extent that it was adequately funded, which is debatable, is even farther behind than it was a couple of years ago. And so both the House and the Senate are considering a range of tax and fee increases, including things such as a delivery fee on online retail and food purchases, increase in the motor vehicle sales tax, registration taxes, and then also a metro-only sales tax proposal that would go to transit. And so all of these are floating along in the transportation bills coming out of the House and Senate. On small cities, like we said, our biggest challenge has been finding a dedicated ongoing funding source. And both the House and the Senate actually create an ongoing dedicated funding for small cities. And they do it in slightly different ways in terms of the fees and the mix of funding that they're looking at. You can see there on the House, their proposal would start at about $38 million a year for that program and grow over time. The Senate would start at about $18 million a year and grow over time. The biggest piece here is the ongoing funding. This program has been funded in fits and starts. Of course, small cities get no money out of the gas tax. They get no money from the state in terms of maintaining their roads, unlike counties, cities over 5,000 and townships. So there's some relief for those projects. And then larger city funding, both through the MSA proposals, we get more money flowing through that system, but then also a look at creating an account outside of that system that would be funded, that would help provide discretionary funding for larger cities beyond the limits of what they can spend their MSA dollars on. And so some pretty significant proposals for ongoing city street funding in both the House and the Senate. And then finally, corridors of commerce. If you recall 2018, there was a lot of consternation about the corridors of commerce program and the geographic distribution. And so since then, the House and the legislature and MnDOT have all been working on ideas to improve that project, to give a little better guidance to MnDOT. The House, on their side, improves regional balance by separating rural projects from metro and metro adjacent projects. That was one of the problems, is what do you do with a project that sort of straddles the metro and greater Minnesota. And then in the Senate, they're still a work in progress, according to key senators, but the end goal is, again, also to enhance the balance of the program. The takeaway is, I think we would prefer the House language so far on this, but the Senate does invest more dollars in corridors of commerce. So that's going through as well, and Shane Zart from our office has been the guy bird dogging that and can certainly help you with any specific comments or questions. So finally, as we sit back in our seats after getting our hot dog, after we sang heartily, "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," what are we going to be telling legislators here for the final 6 weeks? First off, put cities on a firm footing with an LGA increase of at least $100 million. They have to match that House number at a minimum. Update the LGA formula that was worked on and agreed to by all of the major city groups. It's time. The formula needs some updates. Thirdly, proceed carefully with new environmental laws to avoid unnecessary hampering of growth and development in greater Minnesota. We need to make sure that as we do these laws, as we protect the environment, as we protect disadvantaged communities, that we're not casting such a broad blanket that we hamper growth and development throughout the state. Next, pass a robust capital investment bill that invests in water and wastewater infrastructure, as well as other programs that will support greater Minnesota communities. And finally, make significant investments in housing, childcare, and transportation to support communities across the state. So with that, I think we have some questions. that Alex will key up for me. We've got a couple of minutes for questions here, and so we'll see what we can get to. Alex, what have we got?
All right, the first question is, does the 150 million LGA increase affect any payments in 2023?
No. So this would be payments for 2024. Your 2023 LGA that was certified in August of last year and that you based your levy and budgeting on would remain the same. And so this would be a calendar year 2024 issue.
All right, the second question is, do you feel legislators are appreciating our ask to allow TIF to be used for market rate housing in greater Minnesota in the context of the large amount of money being allocated for affordable housing?
Yeah, so one of the items that we're working on has been a broadening of tax increment financing for housing. That proposal actually did make it into the House Property Tax Division report and is moving along towards the full tax committee. So we are getting traction on that particular issue. I think we have yet to see what the Senate will do. And so I would say, you know, from that, on that particular item, we're in as good a position as we currently could be.
All right, the next question is, do you see the House Chair's position on opposing local option sales taxes will hold?
That is a big question. So as just to refresh everyone, there are 36 or 38 proposals for local option sales tax authorizations for cities and counties. The House Tax Chair has taken a firm stance of nope, we're not hearing any of them. We need to look at the whole system. These do nothing but exacerbate inequities between communities. Sales tax is a regressive tax that hits heavier on low income folks. She has a host of reasons. In the Senate, they heard every one of these bills, and some of them will be in the Senate tax bill. And so you are going to have this face-off where you're going to have a whole bunch of these on the Senate side and none of these on the House side. I have to believe that there will be significant pressure on the House Tax Chair to relent and at least take the ones that are fully vetted and ready for prime time. But my guess is that what would come with that is then a closing of the door and more study and work on local option sales taxes overall. That might be how this plays out because I think on the House side, Chair Gomez is going to have a significant number of her members who are going to want these things to do good projects in their communities. So I think it's also hard to say no to cities and counties who followed the rules as they were laid out by the legislature and say, nope, just because you followed the rules, but because we don't like these things writ large, we're not going to acknowledge any of them. So I'm hopeful that something can be done on that front. All right, what else we got?
I believe the next question is directed towards Liz. So if we can pull her up, the question is there a limit in the bill on the number of miles from an area impacted by a permit, or how many people are needed to impact a permit application and approval? And I believe that's the cumulative impacts bill.
Yeah, I believe that did pop up, and thank you, Mayor Fabian, for asking that question. And I'm just going to say it's a tricky one because there have been so many proposals. There was, without getting into boring legislative stuff, there were the initial versions, and then both the House and Senate amended and amended again. So in some versions, there are geographic limitations. In at least one version, there is a basic, I think the Senate proposal originally sort of extended it 10 miles beyond every environmental justice area, which pretty much then covered the entire state. They narrowed it down to a mile. I think the House language, it still has a little bit of areas that are impacted, which creates some squishiness there. So that has, that's an issue that really, again, needs to be sort of narrowed, because again, we want to focus in on the folks who are actually having the problems so that we are, directing resources at people who need help. With respect to how many people are needed to impact a permit application, again, this is something that has been sort of a bit of a moving target. Originally, there was a proposal in the Senate that would have allowed 100 people who lived anywhere in the state to request this cumulative impact analysis, that number has been narrowed down, and it has both in terms of numbers and geography. And I don't know how that will wash out in the final bill, but those are both two issues that are still being negotiated.
All right, Alex, I think we've got time for one more question.
Okay, there's one more question. It says, will the Senate exempt small businesses of 5 employees or less from a paid family medical leave?
I don't know. That I think is a potentially plausible thing that could come out as they get this through the Senate. Like I indicated, I think it is going to be harder to get this bill out of the Senate than it is out of the House. And so I could see some number of employees being exempted. The challenge on that side, though, is you do have folks who are proponents who say, well, we think every Minnesotan should have access to these benefits no matter where they work. And so that's the tension that we'll have to work out. And so I guess the best prognostication that I could give is that it is a possibility. With that, definitely do be in touch if you have other questions on any other specific items. Want to remind you about upcoming events we've got. We've got our CGMC breakfast at the League Conference in Duluth. That's going to be on Friday, the 23rd. And so we'll hopefully see you there. And we haven't determined yet what the topic of conversation will be, but it's going to be a good one. I can guarantee that. And then finally, we've also got the summer conference coming up in Thief River Falls, and registration for that will be opening very soon. I know Mayor Homer is excited to have everybody up to Thief River Falls. Going to put on a great show. I think it's a great, interesting community that more Minnesotans need to learn more about. And so it'll be exciting to have everybody up there. With that, very much thank you for being here and joining us for this halftime, third period, 7-time inning stretch update on the legislature. Lots will be happening. Keep on top of your emails, watch for action alerts, and definitely be in touch if you have any questions about anything that's going on. Have a great afternoon. And again, thank you for being with us this morning. Bye.